The cold glitter of the Chicago Charity Gala was a cage, and Ilara Hayes felt its bars pressing in. The borrowed silk dress was a poor substitute for armor, her hand clutching her son's as if he were her only anchor in a sea of hollow laughter and predatory smiles. The illusion of safety shattered when Richard, her ex-husband, cornered them near the frosted glass of the terrace doors. His presence was a drop of poison in water, his voice a venomous whisper meant only for her ears. "He's coming to live with me, Ilara. The judge agrees it's for the best." His grip on her arm was a public display of ownership, a bruising punctuation to his words. As her defiance began to crumble into quiet desperation, she could feel Leo trembling beside her, a small witness to a war he couldn't understand. But what happened in the next 10 seconds would change everything, and if you watch until the end, you will understand why a single glance can be more powerful than a verdict. Subscribe now and tell us in the comments where you are watching from, because this is a story about the lines we refuse to cross. Ilara Hayes, 32, was an architect who built worlds on paper but couldn't seem to construct a safe one for herself. A single mother by circumstance, not by choice, she moved through life with a quiet resilience that was often mistaken for weakness. Her days were a careful balance of blueprints and school runs, of client meetings and bedtime stories, each moment measured against the looming threat of Richard's influence. She carried herself with a silent dignity, her posture straight even when her spirit felt bowed. Tonight, surrounded by the city's elite, she was an imposter, a ghost haunting a party she had no right to attend, her only purpose to appease the man who sought to dismantle her world piece by piece, starting with her son. The air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and the low hum of self-congratulation. Crystal chandeliers cast fractured rainbows on the polished marble floors, each reflection a distorted version of the truth. The clinking of champagne flutes sounded like tiny, mocking bells, and the hushed conversations were a language of power she would never speak. For Ilara, the grand ballroom was not a place of celebration but a courtroom where she was perpetually on trial. Every glance felt like an accusation, every polite smile a judgment. This opulent world was Richard's natural habitat. For her, it was a beautifully decorated prison, where the walls were made of whispers and the locks were forged from social currency. Her solitude was a constant companion, a shadow that clung to her even in crowded rooms. It was born from a past loss that had taught her the fragility of trust and the cruelty of fate. Now, that solitude was sharpened by the relentless pressure from Richard, a man who wielded his connections like a weapon. He didn't want their son out of love. He wanted him as a trophy, another acquisition to prove his dominance. Ilara's fear was a cold knot in her stomach, the fear of losing Leo, of failing to protect him from the calculated coldness she had escaped. Her strong moral compass, the very core of her identity, felt like a liability in a world that rewarded ruthlessness and punished integrity. Leo, all of 7 years old, pressed himself against her leg, his small hand gripping the silk of her dress. He didn't understand the words, but he understood the shift in his mother's body, the subtle tensing of her muscles, the way her breathing had become shallow. To him, the room was a forest of tall, imposing figures, their faces obscured by shadows and insincere smiles. His father was a handsome stranger who smelled of cologne and anger, a man whose touch felt like a cage. He could feel the vibrations of his mother's fear traveling through her hand into his, a silent alarm that told him they were in danger, even here, in a room filled with music and light. Richard leaned closer, his smile a perfect, cruel curve. "Don't make a scene, Ilara. You know you can't win this. People are watching." His thumb pressed into the delicate skin of her inner arm, a gesture of intimate violence that went unnoticed by the oblivious crowd. He was a master of appearances, a man who could commit an act of cruelty while discussing art or politics. He thrived on her powerlessness, feeding on the quiet desperation in her eyes. He believed he had already won, that her spirit was a fragile thing he could simply crush under the weight of his influence and wealth, leaving her with nothing but the echo of her own defeat. As his words settled over her like a shroud, the ambient noise of the gala seemed to fade into a distant hum. A strange stillness had fallen over a far corner of the room, a pocket of silence in the cacophony. Elara felt a sudden, inexplicable chill, a prickling on her skin as if she were being watched not by the judging eyes of the crowd, but by a single, focused gaze. It was a presence she couldn't see but could feel, with every fiber of her being, an unnerving shift in the room's gravitational pull. A silent power had just entered the equation, and the rules of the game were about to be rewritten. The gray Chicago dawn seeped through the thin curtains of Elara's apartment, illuminating dust motes dancing in the still air. Her world was a landscape of muted colors and quiet routines, a stark contrast to the bold, sweeping lines she drafted for a living. Each morning began, not with a gentle awakening, but with the silent, heavy weight of responsibility settling upon her chest before her eyes even opened. The city outside was a monument to ambition and power, its steel and glass towers scraping a sky she rarely had time to notice. Her own life felt small within it, a series of calculated movements designed for survival. The hushed preparation of Leo's breakfast, the careful budgeting for the train fare, the constant, low-grade hum of anxiety that served as her personal soundtrack. Her commute on the L train was a daily exercise in anonymity. Pressed between strangers, their faces weary and blank in the fluorescent light, she would hold her portfolio case like a shield. It contained blueprints for buildings she would never afford to enter, designs that were celebrated within the sterile walls of her firm, but were ultimately not her own. She saw the city through the smudged glass, a place of beautiful, brutalist structures and deep, unforgiving shadows. Her reflection was a ghost superimposed over the rushing landscape, a woman who felt increasingly transparent. The journey was a metaphor for her existence, moving at high speed through someone else's world, with no control over the destination and no one who truly saw her. At the prestigious firm of Sterling and Croft, Elara was a ghostwriter of architecture. She was the mind behind the firm's most innovative designs, but her name was never the one etched onto the cornerstone. Her boss, Arthur Sterling, was a man of manufactured charm and quiet professional theft. He would praise her work in private with condescending pats on the shoulder, only to present her concepts as his own in client meetings. "Our team's vision," he would say, his gaze sliding past her as if she were part of the furniture. To object would be professional suicide. She needed the job, the meager salary that barely covered rent and Leo's needs, and so she swallowed her pride daily, letting it curdle into a quiet, simmering resentment that she buried beneath layers of professionalism. The pressure was not just professional, it was a crushing financial weight. Divorce had left her with a mountain of debt and a trickle of inconsistent child support from Richard, who used money as another tool of control. Every unexpected expense, a fever, a ripped school uniform, a leaky faucet, was a potential catastrophe. She would sit at her kitchen table late at night, the city lights a cold, distant glitter, staring at a spreadsheet of her finances. The numbers were a merciless jury, always delivering the same verdict. She was failing. This constant state of precarity was the cage Richard had built for her. Long after she had left his house, he knew that by keeping her financially unstable, he kept her perpetually off balance, easier to manipulate and to break. This oppressive reality forced Elara into a secret emotional life. After Leo was asleep, in the sacred quiet of the late hours, she would pull out a worn sketchbook. It was filled not with commercial high-rises or luxury condos, but with designs for community shelters, libraries for underserved neighborhoods, and small, sustainable homes with gardens. These drawings were her silent rebellion, a testament to her belief that architecture should serve and protect, not just impress and dominate. It was in these pages that she was not a victim or an employee, but a creator, a builder of worlds where people like her and Leo could be safe. This was her true self, the woman she fought to keep alive in the shadows of her exhausting days. Her isolation was profound, deepened by a family that viewed her single motherhood as a personal failure. Phone calls with her mother were a minefield of passive-aggressive questions and unsolicited advice. "Are you sure you can handle all of this on your own, dear?" Richard always seemed so stable. Each word was a small, sharp cut, reminding her that she had no safety net, no one to turn to who would simply offer support without judgment. Her independence, the very thing she had fought so hard for, was framed as a reckless mistake. She was an island, and the waters around her were rising, with the tide being controlled by men who believed they owned the ocean. Yet, there was Leo. He was her anchor and her compass. One evening, as she was wearily trying to untangle a knot in her design software, he came to her with a drawing of his own. It was a crayon picture of a small, sunlit house with a crooked chimney and a large protective tree beside it. Underneath, he had drawn two figures holding hands, one tall, one small. "This is our forever house, Mommy," he said, his voice full of innocent certainty. In that moment, the weight on her chest became unbearable, and yet, somehow, manageable. His unwavering faith in her was both a source of immense pressure and her only source of strength. She was fighting for his vision of forever, even if her own had long since faded. The summons came on a Tuesday afternoon. Sterling called her into his glass-walled office, the city skyline framed perfectly behind his expensive leather chair. He informed her that she was to attend the annual Children's Foundation Gala that weekend. "Richard Vance will be there," Sterling said, naming a potential client who could secure the firm's future for the next decade. "I need you to be charming. Represent us well." It was not a request. It was a command wrapped in the illusion of opportunity. Her stomach turned to ice. She knew Richard, her ex-husband, was a benefactor of the foundation. The gala was his territory, his stage. Sterling was unknowingly sending her into the heart of her own personal war zone. The humiliation began with her wardrobe. She stood before her closet, a collection of sensible, professional, and worn-out clothes, and felt a wave of hopeless inadequacy. There was nothing in her possession that would pass for entry into that world of couture and diamonds. The thought of asking for an advance from Sterling was mortifying, and borrowing from a friend felt like admitting defeat. She eventually found a dress at a high-end consignment shop, a sliver of sapphire silk that cost nearly a week's worth of groceries. As she paid for it, she felt like an imposter buying a costume, a fragile disguise for a battle she was already certain she would lose. On the night of the gala, as she fastened a simple silver necklace, she saw the fear reflected in her own eyes. The dress felt foreign against her skin, a beautiful lie. Leo came and stood in the doorway of her bedroom, his small frame silhouetted against the hallway light. He was silent for a moment, his gaze wide with awe. "Mommy," he whispered, his voice full of a child's pure admiration, "you look like a queen from a storybook." His words were a balm and a blade. For him, she would wear the armor. She would walk into that glittering ballroom, into Richard's world, and pretend to be a queen, even as she felt the invisible walls of her prison closing in around her. In a far corner of the ballroom, shielded by the deep shadows of a marble column, a man stood in perfect stillness. He was a void in the glittering chaos, a pocket of absolute silence that seemed to bend the light and sound around it. Dressed in a suit of such dark, immaculate tailoring that it appeared to absorb the room's opulence, he observed the proceedings not as a guest, but as a sovereign surveying his domain. This was Don Marcello Volpe, a name that existed in the city's subconscious, like a foundational myth, whispered, but never spoken aloud. His presence was not announced by entourage or fanfare, but by the respectful distance others kept, a silent, invisible perimeter that no one dared to cross. He held a glass of dark liquor, but his hand was steady, his gaze distant, carrying the weight of a past etched in unseen scars. It was toward this island of quiet authority that Leo ran. Propelled by a child's pure, unthinking instinct for safety, he tore away from his father's venom and his mother's trembling helplessness. He didn't seek out a uniformed guard or a smiling socialite. He sought the most stable point in his spinning world. He navigated the forest of expensive shoes and rustling gowns, and came to a halt behind the leg of the dark suit, hiding his face against the fine wool. The small boy, clutching the trousers of the city's most feared man, was a surreal tableau of innocence seeking refuge in the heart of darkness. For a moment, the entire gala seemed to hold its breath, caught in the gravity of this small, desperate act of faith. Marcello Volpe did not flinch. He did not move away or show a flicker of surprise. Instead, he slowly lowered his gaze to the top of the boy's head. Then, with a deliberation that felt ancient and absolute, he placed his free hand on Leo's small, shaking shoulder. The touch was not gentle, nor was it harsh. It was grounding, a heavy, solid weight that communicated an undeniable sense of protection. The gesture was both a shield for the child and a warning to the world. In that single, silent movement, Marcello claimed the space, the boy, and the moment. The low hum of the party seemed to recede, and a profound stillness emanated from their corner, silencing the hollow laughter and the clinking of crystal. Richard froze, his hands still outstretched from where Alara had pulled away. The color drained from his face, replaced by a mask of pale, primal fear. He recognized the man. Not by name, perhaps, but by the sheer, unassailable aura of power that clung to him like a shroud. He saw not just an individual, but an entire ecosystem of shadow and influence, a force against which his own carefully curated connections were nothing more than dust. The polished cruelty vanished from his expression, replaced by the raw terror of a man who had stumbled into a predator's territory and just threatened its young. His authority, built on social currency and legal intimidation, crumbled into nothingness before a power that needed no introduction. Alara's heart seized in her chest. A new, more potent fear surged through her, eclipsing the dread Richard inspired. She saw her son, her entire world, under the hand of a man who had just turned her ex-husband to stone with a mere glance. Her maternal instinct screamed, overriding all sense of self-preservation. She moved forward, a desperate, trembling rush to retrieve her child from this new, unfathomable danger. "Leo," she breathed, her voice barely a whisper, her hands outstretched. She was prepared to throw herself between her son and this imposing stranger, a fragile shield against a force she could not possibly comprehend. Her only thought was to pull Leo back into the fragile safety of her own embrace. As she reached for Leo, her eyes met Marcello's. Time seemed to fracture. She had expected to find coldness, annoyance, or perhaps the cruel amusement of a predator toying with its prey. Instead, she saw a profound, unsettling recognition. His eyes, the color of a stormy sea, were not empty. They were ancient, weary, and held a flicker of something that looked unnervingly like understanding. He wasn't looking at a hysterical mother. He was looking through her, into the very core of her being. He saw the fierce, breaking heart of a lioness, protecting her cub with nothing but her own spirit. In her terrified defiance, he saw a mirror of a code he understood better than any law written in books. In that silent, loaded exchange, he saw the one thing his world of calculated loyalties and brutal transactions had bled dry, an absolute, incorruptible love. Her protective stance was not a negotiation or a plea. It was a fundamental law of her nature. He, a man who ruled through an inflexible code of honor and retribution, recognized its purest form in the eyes of this complete stranger. She was not weak. She was a fortress built around a single precious life, and he, a king of fortresses built on fear and stone, acknowledged the superior strength of her foundation. For a fleeting second, the chasm between their worlds vanished, bridged by a shared, unspoken principle. Dismissing Richard with a final glance that carried the weight of a death sentence, Marcello knelt slightly, bringing himself closer to Leo's eye level. He did not remove his hand from the boy's shoulder. When he finally spoke, his voice was a low murmur that somehow cut through the ambient noise of the party, a sound like stones shifting deep underground. It was directed at Alara, but every word was a judgment passed upon the man who was now backing away into the crowd. "A man who frightens his own son," Marcello stated, his tone devoid of emotion yet laden with finality, "has forfeited the right to be called a father." It was not an opinion. It was a verdict from the highest court. With that, the encounter was over. Richard had all but vanished, swallowed by the glittering crowd he so desperately belonged to. Marcello gave Leo's shoulder a final, almost imperceptible squeeze before straightening to his full, imposing height. He gave Alara one last, inscrutable look, a look that held both a warning and a promise she couldn't decipher. Then, as silently as he had appeared, he turned and moved away, his discreet security detail materializing from the shadows to fall in step behind him. He didn't look back. The respectful silence that surrounded him moved with him, a tide receding from the shore, leaving a stunned and trembling quiet in its wake. Alara pulled Leo into her arms, holding him so tightly he squirmed. The noise of the gala rushed back, loud and jarring, but the world felt irrevocably altered. The air where Marcello had stood was still charged, humming with the ghost of his authority. She looked at the empty space, then down at her son, whose fear had subsided into a quiet awe. She did not know the man's name, nor did she understand the silent transaction that had just occurred. But she knew, with a certainty that chilled her to the bone, that she had been seen. In the heart of her enemy's territory, she had inadvertently stepped into the protection of a king, and she was terrified of the price. The days that followed the gala were a study in forced normalcy. Alara moved through her life as if walking on a thin sheet of ice, terrified that any sudden movement would plunge her back into the freezing water of that night. She focused on Leo, on her blueprints, on the rhythmic clatter of the train, anything to fill the silence where the memory of Marcello Volpe resided. But his presence was an echo she couldn't escape. She would feel a sudden chill on a crowded street and look up to see a dark town car idling at the corner, its tinted windows revealing nothing. It was never there when she looked a second time. She told herself it was paranoia, a side effect of trauma, but the feeling of being watched was as real and persistent as the city's cold, damp wind. A week later, a crisis erupted at the firm. Richard, in a move of petty vengeance, had used his influence to sabotage the zoning permits for Sterling and Croft's most important project. Panic rippled through the office, and Arthur Sterling, his charm curdling into blame, directed his fury at Alara. He implied her personal drama had jeopardized the entire company. She spent 2 sleepless nights preparing a defense, expecting to be fired. Then, on the 3rd morning, she arrived to find Sterling beaming. The zoning issue had vanished. A rival firm, which had been blocking their progress, had inexplicably withdrawn their objection overnight. Sterling took all the credit, but Alara felt a familiar, cold certainty in the pit of her stomach. A debt she had never agreed to was being paid on her behalf. The illusion of coincidence shattered a few days later. Seeking refuge in the quiet, cavernous reading room of the Chicago Public Library, she was sketching in her private notebook when a shadow fell across the page. She looked up into Marcello Volpe's impossibly still face. He was standing by her table, holding a heavy, leather-bound book. He didn't smile. He simply looked at her, then at her drawing, a design for a small, sunlit community clinic. The silence between them was a living thing, thick with unspoken questions and unreadable intentions. He had not followed her here by chance. His presence was a deliberate statement, a quiet assertion of his access to her world, even to its most sacred private corners. "You build things that heal," he said, his voice a low timbre that didn't disturb the library's reverent hush. It wasn't a question. It was an observation, one that revealed he saw far more than just lines on paper. He saw the intent behind her work, the core of her morality that she guarded so fiercely. Alara's heart hammered against her ribs, a frantic bird in a cage. Fear and a strange, unwelcome fascination warred within her. This man, whose empire was built on breaking things, people, laws, lives, was standing in a temple of knowledge, speaking of healing. The contradiction was dizzying, a glimpse into the complex, fractured humanity she had sensed behind his cold, controlled exterior. She could only manage a nod, her throat too tight for words. He placed the book he was holding on the edge of her table. It was a rare first edition of an architectural treatise she had only read about. He pushed it gently toward her without another word. The gesture was both an offering and a display of power, a demonstration that he knew her interests, her passions, and could acquire anything, even the intangible pieces of her soul. He held her gaze for a beat longer, a silent communication passing between them that she was too terrified to interpret. Then, He turned and walked away, his footsteps making no sound on the worn marble floor, leaving the book and the weight of his presence behind. Ilara did not touch the book. She packed her things with trembling hands and fled the library, leaving the priceless volume on the table as if it were a bomb. That night, she couldn't sleep. She researched his name online, scrolling through veiled news articles and redacted court documents that painted a picture of a brutal, untouchable figure at the head of the city's oldest crime syndicate, the Volpe family. The name was synonymous with shadow governance, with violence that was as elegant as it was final. Every word she read was a confirmation of her worst fears. The man who had protected her son was a monster. And yet, she could not reconcile the terrifying headlines with the weary understanding in his eyes. She began to change her routines, taking different trains, visiting new coffee shops, avoiding the places where she had felt his gaze. She tried to make herself invisible, to shrink back into the anonymity of the city. But it was like trying to hide from the sky. One rainy afternoon, as she and Leo were leaving a small museum, her umbrella was caught by a sudden gust of wind and turned inside out. As she struggled with the mangled metal, a black car pulled up to the curb. The back window lowered, and Marcelo looked out at her, his expression unreadable. He didn't speak. He just watched her get soaked, a silent observer to her small, frustrating struggle against the elements. The moment was surreal, a clash of two realities. Here she was, a single mother, wrestling with a broken umbrella in the pouring rain. And there he was, a king in his armored chariot, separated from the storm by a wall of glass and steel. He could have offered her a ride, a simple act of courtesy. But he didn't. He just watched, his stillness a stark contrast to the chaotic weather. It wasn't an act of cruelty. It felt more like a test, or perhaps a moment of profound contemplation. He was seeing her not just as a woman to be protected, but as a creature of a different world, one who fought her own small, dignified battles without asking for help. When she finally managed to wrangle the umbrella shut and pull Leo closer under the meager shelter of a building's awning, the car window slid silently up. The vehicle pulled away from the curb and disappeared into the gray wash of the rain. Ilara was left shivering, not entirely from the cold. His inaction was more unsettling than any direct gesture would have been. He was not trying to rescue her from life's small indignities. He was guarding her from its mortal dangers. The distinction was terrifying. It meant he believed those dangers were real, and that they were close enough to warrant his constant, silent vigilance. This silent guardianship began to fray the edges of her resolve. She was living in a state of heightened awareness, constantly scanning crowds, analyzing shadows. The fear was exhausting, but beneath it, something else was taking root, a dangerous, reluctant sense of safety. She hadn't received a single threatening letter from Richard's lawyers since the gala. Her boss treated her with a new, fearful respect. The small aggressions that had defined her daily life seemed to have evaporated. She was living in a bubble of calm, and she knew Marcello Volpe was the one holding it intact. She hated her dependence on this dark, invisible force, yet a part of her was deeply, shamefully grateful. He, in turn, found himself drawn to the quiet rhythm of her life. From the insulated silence of his car, he would watch her and Leo in the park. He saw her push her son on a swing, her face illuminated by a rare ray of sunlight, her laughter a sound he hadn't heard in years. He saw her patience, her gentleness, the fierce, uncomplicated love that radiated from her. These simple, mundane scenes were like glimpses into a foreign country, a land of light and warmth he had been exiled from long ago. She was a reflection of every choice he hadn't made, of the man he might have been had his path not been forged in blood and shadow. This fascination was a weakness he could not afford. It was a crack in the armor he had spent a lifetime building. His world demanded absolute control, emotional detachment. Feelings were liabilities, connections were vulnerabilities, to be exploited by his enemies. Yet, he continued to watch over her. He told himself it was a matter of honor. He had intervened, and therefore she and the boy were under his protection. It was a simple, transactional code, but it was a lie. He was drawn to her light, not as a moth to a flame, but as a man who had been in the dark for so long he had forgotten the feeling of the sun. The moral ambiguity of their connection was a constant, simmering tension. She represented a world of clear lines between right and wrong, a world he had long since abandoned for one of shades of gray. For her, to accept his protection was to be complicit in his sins. For him, to protect her was to invite a purity into his life that threatened to expose the darkness within. They were two opposing forces, bound by a single moment of shared humanity, circling each other in a dance of fear and fascination. The space between them crackled with the energy of what was forbidden, what was dangerous, and what was, against all logic, inevitable. The fragile peace shattered on a Thursday evening. Ilara was putting Leo to bed when the sound of shattering glass erupted from her living room. Her blood ran cold. She grabbed her son, her body moving on pure instinct, and barricaded them both in his bedroom, shoving a dresser in front of the door. Her hands shook as she fumbled for her phone to call the police, her mind racing. Was it a random burglary? Or was it Richard, finally making a move that couldn't be ignored? She could hear heavy footsteps inside her apartment, the sound of her small, safe world being violated, torn apart. Through the crack under the door, she saw a shadow pass, then another. They weren't speaking. The silence was more terrifying than any threat. They were professionals. Her call to 911 went through, but she knew they would be too late. She clutched Leo, who was crying silently into her shoulder, and whispered that everything would be okay, a lie that tasted like ash in her mouth. She was trapped. Her carefully constructed life, her desperate attempts to remain invisible, had failed. The wolves were inside her home, and she was utterly, completely alone. Then, through the sounds of her own frantic heartbeat, she heard something else. A car screeching to a halt on the street below, the heavy slam of a door. The intruders in her living room suddenly went still, a new tension filling the air. She heard a low, muffled exchange, then a sudden, sickening thud. A moment of absolute silence followed, heavier and more final than any sound. The shadow under the door did not move again. A new presence was in her apartment, one whose authority was absolute, and whose arrival had changed the very nature of the threat. The dresser blocking the bedroom door moved, pushed aside from the other side with an unnerving, effortless strength. The door swung open. Marcelo Volpe stood in the frame, his dark suit immaculate, his face a mask of controlled fury. He was not looking at her. His gaze was fixed on the living room behind him, a silent promise of retribution for the men who had dared to cross his line. Then his eyes met hers, and in their stormy depths, she saw not the coldness of a killer, but the fierce, possessive rage of a guardian. In that moment, the line between her world and his was erased forever. He moved into the small bedroom, his presence so absolute it seemed to consume the very air and light. His gaze swept over the overturned toy chest, the scattered books, a child's sanctuary desecrated, and a cold, controlled fury settled in his features. Ilara saw it not in a scowl or a clenched fist, but in the utter stillness of his body, the terrifying calm of a storm's eye. He was a creature of violence, and his violence had just saved her, but the debt felt like a chain tightening around her throat. She instinctively pulled Leo behind her, a futile but necessary gesture. She was shielding her son not from the danger that was gone, but from the man who had erased it, a man who was himself the embodiment of a far greater, more permanent threat. His eyes, dark and unreadable, finally settled on her. He saw her defiance, the slight tremor in her hands as she held Leo's shoulders. He saw that she was not looking at a savior. In her gaze, he was a different species of predator, and he recognized the bitter truth in her assessment. He was used to commanding obedience through fear, but this was different. This was a moral judgment, a quiet condemnation that pierced his armor more effectively than any bullet ever could. He took a single, deliberate step forward, and the small room seemed to shrink. The scent of the cold night air and something metallic, the scent of his world, clung to him, an invisible shroud that was now settling over hers. "They were sent by your ex-husband," he stated, his voice a low, gravelly timbre that cut through her fear. It was not an accusation, but a fact laid bare. A message. He will not send another. The finality in his tone was absolute, a promise of retribution so certain it felt like a law of nature. He was closing a door on a part of her life, but in doing so, he was locking her into his. He was solving her problem with a solution she was too terrified to comprehend. The silence that followed was heavy with the unspoken. Richard's fate had just been sealed, and she was now inextricably linked to the man who would decide it. She felt a sickening wave of complicity, a stain spreading across her soul. Her own code, the one that had guided her through a life of quiet integrity, demanded she speak. Gratitude was a lie she could not tell. Why? The word escaped her lips, a raw, trembling whisper that was an act of profound rebellion. She was not supposed to ask. She was supposed to be silent, to accept the protection and ignore the cost. But she had to know. She was looking at a man who ruled a dark kingdom, a man who had no logical reason to care about a single mother and her son. The question was not a plea for information. It was a demand for a piece of his humanity, a challenge for him to reveal the reason for this terrible, life-altering intervention. His focus shifted from her to the small, terrified boy peeking out from behind her legs. For an instant, the mask of the unassailable Dawn slipped, and Alara saw something else flicker in his eyes, a shadow of an old, deep wound. Her question had not angered him. It had struck a nerve buried so deep he had perhaps forgotten it was there. He was seeing not just Leo, but another child, another time, another failure. He, who had built an empire on the principle of absolute control, was momentarily lost in a memory he could not command. He had broken his own cardinal rule. He had made this personal. The decision to protect her had not been a strategic move. It had been an impulse born from a ghost. He knelt, a slow, deliberate movement that felt both shocking and sacred. The powerful Don Martello Volpe, a man before whom the city's most powerful figures bowed, was lowering himself to the level of a child. He ignored Alara completely, his entire being focused on Leo. He extended a hand, not to touch, but as a simple, open offering. "In my world," he said, his voice softer now, imbued with a weariness that seemed centuries old, "we protect our own, and a child's home is sacred ground." He was not speaking to her, or even to Leo. He was speaking his creed into the silence, reaffirming a law that he had just honored, even if it meant shattering his own isolation. In that moment, Ilara understood. The transgression was not the violence in the other room. It was this act of kneeling. It was the confession hidden in his words. He was not protecting her because she was special. He was protecting her because his own soul demanded it. His violent world was governed by a fierce, almost monastic code, and she and Leo had become unwitting symbols of its most sacred tenet. She saw the immense, crushing loneliness of his existence, a king on a throne of shadows, bound by an honor no one in her world could possibly understand. Her fear did not recede, but it made room for a devastating wave of empathy. He was not a monster. He was a man living by the consequences of a vow made long ago. The air between them changed, charged with the energy of this shared, unspoken revelation. It was a moment of dangerous intimacy, more profound than any touch. He had allowed her to see the ghost that haunted him, and she had looked upon it not with judgment, but with a flicker of understanding. He slowly rose to his full height, the moment of vulnerability passing, the mask of the dawn sliding back into place. But the connection remained, an invisible thread now woven between their two souls. He had broken his code of emotional detachment, and in doing so, he had irrevocably bound her to his fate, making her the sole witness to his buried humanity. He turned to leave, his duty as a protector momentarily superseding his role as a confessor. The world of consequences waited for him in the ransacked living room, but before he crossed the threshold, he paused and looked back at her. His gaze was no longer a shield. It was an open question. He had shown her his reason, his wound. Now the choice was hers, to retreat back into the ruins of her old life, or to accept the terrifying sanctuary he offered. The silence was her answer. She did not move, she did not speak, but her eyes held his, and in their depths, He saw not fear, but a dawning, reluctant acceptance. She would not run. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod, a silent acknowledgement of the pact that had just been forged in trauma and truth. Then he was gone, a shadow disappearing into the chaos he was about to command. Alara stood frozen in the sudden quiet of the bedroom, the weight of his protection settling upon her like a crown of thorns. She could hear the quiet, efficient sounds of his men arriving on the street below, the ghosts of her past life being erased by the architects of her new one. Nothing had been spoken, yet everything had been said. She had seen the heart of the king, and now she was part of his kingdom. If this story has captured you, let the world know. Like and share this video, and tell us in the comments what you think Alara should do next. Your voice is part of this journey, a whisper in the shadows that will decide their fate. The aftermath was a silent, bloodless procedure. Marcello's men, ghosts in dark suits, moved through her violated apartment with the detached efficiency of surgeons. They did not speak to her. They wiped away fingerprints, replaced the shattered window with a panel of dark wood, and removed the two bodies with a quiet finality that was more chilling than the preceding violence. Alara stood in the doorway of Leo's room, holding her sleeping son, a silent spectator to the erasure of her own life. The home she had fought to build, a sanctuary of small routines and quiet love, was being sterilized, its history rewritten by these men from a world she did not understand. When they were gone, an unnatural quiet descended, thicker and more suffocating than the fear that had come before. The air was clean, but the space was haunted by the echo of his authority. 2 days later, she was moved, not consulted, not asked, but relocated. A sleek black car, as silent as the men who drove it, transported her and Leo to a high-rise apartment overlooking the steel-gray expanse of Lake Michigan. It was a place of minimalist luxury, with floor-to-ceiling windows and furniture that seemed to float. It was beautiful, sterile, and utterly foreign. This was not a home. It was a safe house, a gilded cage. Every object, from the crisp linen sheets to the state-of-the-art security system, was a reminder of her new status. She was a protected asset. Standing before the vast window, with the sprawling, indifferent city below, she understood that her old life, with its small freedoms and familiar struggles, had been surgically removed. She had been saved from one prison, only to be placed in another, far more opulent and inescapable. Marcello vanished. There were no calls, no messages, no dark cars idling on the street below. The silence he left behind was a physical presence, a constant, low hum in the background of her new, insulated existence. She knew, with a chilling certainty, that his disappearance was a strategic retreat. The attack on her apartment had been a challenge to his authority, a violation of his territory. His response would be swift, brutal, and conducted far from the light of her world. He was distancing himself to protect her not from his enemies, but from the fallout of his own retribution. He had retreated into the shadows of his kingdom to fight a war she had inadvertently started, leaving her in a silent fortress to await the outcome, a queen in exile, with no knowledge of the battle being waged in her name. She tried to stitch the pieces of her life back together, but the fabric was irrevocably torn. She returned to work at Sterling & Croft, where Arthur Sterling now treated her with a nervous, almost fearful deference. The mundane dramas of the office, the deadlines, the client egos, the stolen credit, felt like a play being performed in a foreign language. Her mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment Marcello had stood in her doorway, a figure of absolute, terrifying control. The memory had recalibrated her entire reality. How could she worry about a zoning permit when she had seen a man's life extinguished with a silent nod? The void left by his absence was a constant ache, a phantom limb. She had been terrified of his presence, but she found herself utterly adrift in the emptiness he had left behind. Night after night, she would stand at the vast window, a solitary figure against the glittering backdrop of the city. The rain would come, tracing lonely, erratic paths down the glass, blurring the distant lights into a melancholic wash of color. The only sound in the apartment was the soft, rhythmic ticking of a heavy marble clock on the mantelpiece, each second a deliberate, measured beat marking the passage of her suspended life. She was safe. Leo slept peacefully in his new room, untroubled by nightmares. She had everything a person could want: security, comfort, a breathtaking view. But she had never felt more isolated. The luxury surrounding her was a constant, mocking reminder of the price of her safety, a world of beautiful, empty surfaces, with a terrifying darkness just beneath. The consequences of his protection rippled outward, reaching her in veiled whispers and stark headlines. One morning, the front page of the newspaper reported a catastrophic fire at a warehouse owned by a rival syndicate, the same one Richard had cultivated connections with. The article called it a tragic accident. Alara knew better. It was a message written in ash and smoke. She began to connect the dots. A key political ally of her ex-husband abruptly resigned, citing personal reasons. A judge known for his corruptibility suddenly retired. Marcelo was not just protecting her. He was systematically dismantling Richard's world, piece by piece, with the cold, impersonal precision of a demolitions expert. The weight of her complicity pressed down on her, the sickening knowledge that this silent, brutal war was being fought in her name. Her fear, a constant companion for so long, began to curdle into something else, a sharp, painful lucidity. She was no longer a passive victim swept up in events beyond her control. She was the epicenter of the storm. That night in her apartment, a choice had been made, not by her, but for her, and she was now living with its consequences. She stopped waiting for him to reappear, to explain, to offer comfort. She began to study the city from her window, not as a backdrop, but as a map of power, a chessboard of alliances and territories she was just beginning to understand. Her innocence had been a casualty of that night, but in its place, a hardened, pragmatic awareness was taking root. She was no longer just the architect of buildings. She was becoming the architect of her own survival in this new, dangerous world. One afternoon, a package arrived. It was delivered by a courier who did not ask for a signature and vanished as silently as he had appeared. Inside, wrapped in simple brown paper, was the rare architectural treatise from the library. There was no note, no card, no indication of the sender. But she knew. It was a ghost of their connection, a quiet, deliberate gesture across the chasm of silence that separated them. The book was not a gift. It was a reminder that he had not forgotten her, that his watchfulness was constant, even in his absence. She ran her fingers over the worn leather cover, the weight of it in her hands both a comfort and a confirmation of her gilded cage. He was everywhere and nowhere, a silent warden whose presence she felt in every secure moment. She found herself dwelling on the moment he had knelt before Leo, the instant his mask of impenetrable control had slipped. His actions had never been about saving her. They had been about honoring a sacred, broken piece of his own past. His withdrawal now felt less like a rejection and more like an act of self-preservation. He was protecting her from his world, yes, but he was also protecting himself from her. She represented a light, a moral clarity that threatened the carefully constructed darkness he inhabited. The distance he kept was not just for her safety, it was the space he needed to fight the war against his enemies, and the quieter, more dangerous war against the humanity she had reawakened within him. The silence stretched from days into weeks, becoming its own form of language. It was a testament to the gravity of their bond, a space filled with the weight of everything left unsaid. Alara would stand at her window, looking at her own reflection superimposed over the distant, silent city. She saw a woman she barely recognized, stronger, colder, her eyes holding a knowledge of the shadows that she could never unlearn. The quiet was no longer an emptiness to be feared, but a state of being she had come to inhabit. It was the echo of his promise and the measure of his sacrifice, a prolonged, resonant hush that held the unspoken truth of their shared fate. Months bled into a season, and the silence became a landscape Alara learned to navigate. The gilded cage, once a symbol of her confinement, slowly transformed into a studio, a sanctuary where she sketched with a feverish intensity. She poured the fear, the isolation, and the terrifying clarity of her new reality into her work. She designed not for Sterling and Croft, but for herself, submitting a proposal for a new pediatric care wing at a downtown community hospital under a pseudonym. When it was accepted, celebrated for its innovative use of light and space to promote healing, she felt the first, true flicker of her own power returning. She had taken the sterile safety he had given her and used it to cultivate a garden in a concrete world, a quiet act of defiance against the shadows that had defined her. The day of the groundbreaking ceremony was crisp and bright, the autumn sun glinting off the surrounding skyscrapers. Ilara stood near the podium, not as a guest, but as the celebrated architect. Leo, holding her hand, looked up at her with an uncomplicated pride that was worth more than any award. She felt a profound sense of peace, a feeling so foreign it was almost jarring. As the city officials gave their speeches, she scanned the small, hopeful crowd, nurses, donors, community members. And then she felt it. That familiar, unnerving prickle on her skin. The sudden drop in atmospheric pressure that signaled his presence. Her gaze swept to the periphery, beyond the smiling faces, to a figure standing half obscured by the shadow of a neighboring building. It was him. He stood perfectly still, a dark, unchanging silhouette against the city's constant motion. He was not there as a threat or a guardian, but as a witness. Across the distance, their eyes met. The chasm of silence and violence that separated their worlds collapsed into a single, breathless moment of understanding. He saw her not as the terrified woman from the gala, but as a creator standing in the full light of her own achievement. He saw the building that wasn't yet there, a testament to the very thing he had recognized in her from the beginning, the instinct to build, to heal, to protect. And she, in turn, saw him not as a monster or a king, but as the keeper of a terrible, lonely promise, his duty fulfilled. She was the proof that his brutal code could, in its own dark way, shelter something good. He offered no smile, no overt sign of recognition. But as the ceremonial first shovel of dirt was turned, he gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was not directed at her, but at the patch of earth where the foundation would be laid. It was a gesture of profound, silent respect. A blessing from the underworld for a structure dedicated to life. In that small movement, she saw his full and final act of redemption. It was not in changing who he was, but in acknowledging the value of a world he could never be a part of. He had not pulled her into his darkness. He had simply cleared the shadows from her path so she could find her own sun. Then, as quietly as he had appeared, he turned and was gone, absorbed back into the anonymous flow of the city from which he had emerged. Ilara did not watch him leave. She drew her attention back to the ceremony, to the sound of applause, to the warm, solid weight of her son's hand in hers. A single tear traced a path down her cheek, a warm, silent acknowledgement of the debt and the gift. He had given her back her life, and she had built a future with it, a future he could only ever watch from a distance. Her redemption was not in escaping the darkness, but in learning how to build in its shadow. Their story was never meant for words, but for the silent spaces in between, and if you felt its truth in your own heart, then its purpose is fulfilled. Let us know this journey moved you by liking and sharing this story. Subscribe for more tales that find light in the darkest of places, and tell us in the comments what that final, silent nod truly meant. For in the end, some bonds are not forged in promises, but in the profound, unspoken understanding that even a king of shadows can bow to the light.